If you've ever said either of these things, accounting is so intimidating, I just let my bookkeeper take care of it, or I look at my P&L but I don't really understand what I'm supposed to do with all this information, then this episode is just for you.
Running a service business can be hard. It is not unusual for business owners in industries like contracting, home repair, auto repair, business-to-business services like janitorial, IT and accounting, and many others to feel overwhelmed by all the priorities facing them at any given time. Between addressing the needs of the customers, managing the employees, figuring out the financials, and getting processes in place, feeling like you're making significant progress on your business journey can be difficult. Welcome to Service Industry Success, hosted by Brian Harding. Each week, Brian will look at real-world strategies for building the business you are dreaming of, while also sharing tactics to get through some of the most frustrating parts of business ownership with a lot more ease. Let's get started.
So most business owners I work with are either intimidated by the P&L and avoid it at all costs, or they don't understand it well enough to use it as a decision-making and progress reporting tool it should be, or they completely outsource the responsibility of monitoring it altogether. I was recently working with a client named Jackie who had not looked at her P&L for about 9 months. By the time I got involved, about 6 months in, so much damage had been done because she had not been aware that she was losing money. And it's going to take a significant amount of time to overcome this. It's a real problem. So just this is not one of those things where it's better to just avoid it and hope that it's going to be okay. We have to know the math. The math does not care if we know the math. The math will absolutely, though, dictate if we make it or not. This is one of those areas in business where we may not like what we see. We may not fully understand it, but we better figure it out anyway. So this is just not something we can afford to ignore. We have to at least have a basic understanding of it, or have somebody on staff who has a pretty good understanding of it and who can take care of this. One of the things I've seen, though, is people, business owners specifically, have a bookkeeper or sometimes a CPA who, quote unquote, does the books. And the business owner will have the assumption that the CPA is reading the P&L and paying attention to that, and would alert the business owner if something catastrophic were happening or if they were losing money or whatever. Well, unless there's some kind of agreement, a specific agreement between the parties where the CPA has said, yes, I'm going to take responsibility of reading your P&L, which would be unusual. They're not doing that. They assume the business owner is taking care of that. So it's not unusual to have a situation where the business owner assumes the CPA is taking care of this responsibility of reading the P&L and making sure the company is profitable, and the CPA is under the assumption that the business owner is taking care of it. That's a pretty common situation. So if you're in the camp where you have a CPA or bookkeeper, quote unquote, doing the books, we got to get pretty clear and specific about whose responsibility is it to do what. Who ultimately has responsibility for reading the P&L and making sure the company is profitable. Now, I can assure you, the bookkeeper and CPA are going to say that's the business owner's job, and I could understand that. On the other hand, there's times where business owners don't know and they have the ability to hire somebody to take care of it. So I could fully support that. What I don't support is assumptions where both parties believe the other person is doing it. So this is just not. This is one of the seven deadly defects. Like not having money to pay the bills and going broke is one of the seven deadly defects. We have to pay attention to this. So while there's a number of things I could talk about when it comes to reading a P&L to make it less intimidating and a more useful tool for you, going over all that would take at least an hour. It wouldn't take 5 hours. We can go through it pretty quickly, but it would take about an hour probably for me to go and hit all those things, which is obviously more time than we have here. So I'm just going to go over some basic information, which will hopefully help you. My goal is just for this to be a less intimidating thing. Reading a P&L should not be intimidating. The P&L, reading it should take less than 15 minutes tops, like hopefully 5 minutes or less. And one of the things that I would really encourage folks is just to understand the P&L should answer all your financial questions. The P&L should not create questions. So you should not look at your P&L and go, what the heck does this mean? Or what's in this category? It should answer all the questions. This is the tool that's supposed to give clear information about what's going on, how much money is being spent on what. This is not the tool to prompt investigations. That is not what it's supposed to be. Now, I understand for some folks that is what it is. Um, they'll look at things and go, that seems to be really, shop supplies went up $10,000 this month. What is in shop supplies? Well, it shouldn't be that. We should know what is in these categories. We should know what we're looking at when we see this document. So this is supposed to be a quick tool to give us a progress report and tell us what's working and what's not working. Were we hitting our goals? Were we not hitting our goals financially? It should not prompt questions. So just kind of fundamentally, I'd hope you would get, just kind of come to grips with that this is supposed to answer questions, not prompt them. The next thing I would say is let's commit to taking time to read this thing every month after the month closes. So one of the things I recommend is having an agreed upon date with whomever is doing your books, whether that's an internal accounting department or an external bookkeeping service or whatever, and having a day of the month that we agree upon that the previous month shall close by this date, whether it's the 5th or the 8th or the 10th. Um, I wouldn't want to make it the 25th of next month, but it's not reasonable for it to be the first or second or third either. So we got to figure out what's a reasonable amount of time for the books to get closed. And on this date, whatever it is, the 8th or 10th or whatever, on this date, I should know I can look at the books and be 100% sure that the information on here is accurate. And then I have to take the time to actually read this thing every month. Like, this is one of those things where we cannot get familiar with it. We cannot enhance our skills and learn what we don't know if we just avoid it. So just carve out one day a month to spend a half an hour looking at this thing. If something you're not familiar with at all, then maybe carve out an hour to look at it. Like, we got to get familiar with this document. And the goal is to get where we can glance at it in 5 minutes or again, maybe 15 minutes tops. You can have a handle on what's going right, what's going wrong, and we're moving on to something else. This should not be a laborious process. Now, learning it could take some time, but once you have it, this should not be a time-consuming endeavor to look at your P&L. It literally should take 5 minutes, up to 15. The next thing I would recommend is figuring out for your industry what should be in your cost of goods sold and what your target gross margin should be. So cost of goods sold is, those are the things that are direct expenses. They're tied directly to providing the service you provide. Overhead expenses would be anything where if you didn't run a single call, you didn't take a single job, you didn't invoice a single job, you didn't have a single customer for a month, overhead expenses is all the bills you would still have. So this would be, your rent, obviously, and medical insurance, and taxes, and all that kind of stuff. So these are things that you have whether you run calls or not. Um, Direct expenses, which are also called cost of goods sold, these are things that are tied directly to providing your service. So what I would recommend is finding out what is that arrangement, what is a cost of goods sold in your industry. There's certain things like cell phones that you could make a pretty compelling case either way that cell phones are overhead, because you have the bill, whether or not you're running calls. On the other hand, these are tied directly to running calls. You wouldn't need cell phones if you didn't have people out in the field running calls. So sometimes you're going to run into a situation like that where a judgment call might be made. Now, in my opinion, cell phones would be overhead expense. It would not be a direct expense. But it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what your industry standard is, because one of the things you want to do is establish a gross margin that you're going to aim for. So you have a top line number revenue and you have a bottom line number profit. Those are generally the two things that everybody looks at first on a P&L, and everything else in the middle seems to be just a bunch of hodgepodge of numbers. I would argue that perhaps the most important number on the P&L is your gross margin, because most of the things you can really have dramatic impact on are direct expenses, labor, of course, job materials, supplies, and all that kind of stuff. So I think that the gross margin is probably the most important number on the P&L. If you have a good gross margin, I can guarantee you're going to have a good bottom line number, unless you're doing some kind of crazy expense on advertising or something like that, or your rent's way out of control, which is unlikely. But in most cases, if you're gross margin's in good shape, you're going to have a healthy bottom line also. But my point is, we can't have if you're last week I talked about carpet cleaning companies. I'll talk about that again. So if you're a carpet cleaning company in Las Vegas and you say, well, I want to shoot for a 60% gross margin, and because I heard that somebody in Massachusetts is doing really well and they have a 60% margin, if there are things that they include in their cost of goods sold are not the same as yours, like, for example, if they include their cell phone bill in that category and you do not, it's not apples to apples anymore. So you can't compare the gross margin anymore because what's in the cost of goods sold is not the same for both parties. So it's really important if you're going to try to figure out what an industry standard is, what is a reasonable goal for you, for your gross margin, which you should have a goal for that. Then you should know what that should be. You also then have to know what should be included in that calculation. What's a direct expense to hit that gross margin? So this may take some doing. You may have to ask your CPA. You may have to ask an industry association you belong to. You may have to ask a friend who lives in a different state, or maybe even somebody who local that you trust would give you a straight answer. And we're not asking for the secret sauce on anything. We're just asking what are the things you include in your direct expenses? What do you include in a cost of goods sold expenses? It's generally going to be 8 or 10 things. It's not going to be 50. So this should be pretty quick. Um, so that's the first and foremost thing, is figuring out what the gross margin should be. So to be clear, the gross margin is the percentage. When you're looking at your P&L, you got gross profit, which is in dollars, and you got gross margin, which is the percentage over on the right when you're looking at the cost of goods sold there. And then the next thing is to make your P&L easier to read. Here's how I kind of classify the data you're going to see on there. Again, you got a million things. You got top line. I care about the gross margin a lot. Then you got the bottom line, and then you've got sometimes hundreds of other numbers on the P&L, and it can just seem overwhelming. So to quickly get through the things that don't matter as much, I classify things 4 ways. First of all, what are the things I can't do anything about? Well, I can't do anything about B&O taxes, so I really don't care about that. I mean, I care about it, but I don't care about it when I'm looking at the P&L. I can't do anything about it, so why am I even paying attention to this? So I will literally go through until I memorize these categories enough to know intuitively without having to have reminders what to ignore. I'll go through and just put a line through, like literally draw a line through anywhere it says taxes. I can't do anything about that. So why am I going to worry about it? I'm not going to consume um, energy and brain power trying to figure out the percentage of B&O tax because I can't change it. So who cares? The next thing is I put an A next to or scratch out things that I should evaluate once a year, like advertising. I'm not going to make a month-to-month decision on advertising, probably. I'm not going to make a month-to-month decision on rent. There are certain things that you just don't make month-to-month decisions on. So you'll know as you go through, categorize things that you should look at annually, and maybe schedule, once a year you're going to do it in January, December, June, whatever month you want. And it may not be the same for all categories. Some things you may have to look at different times a year, but these are things you're going to look at annually, or at least you're going to look at every 5 years. Like, you can't change your rent month to month in most cases. And then you have after you have removed everything you can't do anything about, and you've removed the things that you can only deal with, or only should deal with once a year, you're left with 2 things. You have all things that are high impact, or I'm sorry, high influence. Some have low impact, meaning the dollars are not very significant, and some things have high impact. So the last 2 categories would be high influence, low impact. This would be things like if you're spending $300 a month on office supplies, well, you can have a lot of influence on that, but it doesn't have much impact on the bottom line. So who cares? And then the fourth category, of course, is high influence, high impact. And generally, when you've gone through the other 3 and you've kind of eliminated things you can't do anything about, you've kind of made a note to come back to the things you deal with annually, and you've eliminated the things that are high influence but low impact. You're going to be left with somewhere between 4 and 8 categories of things that really you can influence dramatically and um, have a great, significant impact on the bottom line. Oftentimes that's gonna be wages, shop supplies, job materials, that kind of thing. So that's how I do it. I just kind of break them down into those 4 categories. But the first thing is, even if you're intimidated by this, commit to once a month reading the P&L after the month closes. Get that date that you can be assured that the information is good. Nothing worse than looking at your P&L at the end of the month and woohoo, we made $40,000 last month. And then somebody comes and says, oh, yeah, we had to add this invoice for $26,000. Now you're down to only making 14,000 or whatever. Um, those are tough. So don't set yourself up for that. And then the most important thing I think for most service companies is learning what should be in your cost of goods sold. Get with your CPA, a peer you trust, an industry association, and find out what that gross margin target should be for your industry, or at least one that you can shoot for in your company. I think that's really important to have that singular number to aim for, because you're going to find that most of the things you have that are high influence, high impact are going to be in the cost of goods sold there. So again, take the time to read every month after the month closes. Learn what should be in your cost of goods sold and your target gross margin, and then break it down into 4 categories: things I can't do anything about, things I should evaluate once a year, things that are high influence, low impact, and things that are high influence, high impact. And you're generally going to end up with about 4 to 8 categories that you should really pay attention to, and then that'll get you started at least. Again, I could spend a lot of time talking about other nuances and more sophisticated topics about how to read a P&L. But if you stick to those things, you're going to be on the right track. It'll make it a lot easier and less overwhelming, less intimidating. So that's it for this week. As always, please share this podcast with a friend or colleague if they're a business owner in the service industry. We're trying to help as many folks as we can. Our audience is growing. I sure thank you guys who have passed this along. I appreciate that. We're nowhere near where we want to be, though, so we got lots of room to grow. So if you could pass us along to anybody you know who owns a service industry, that'd be awesome. And give us a rating review if you haven't already. Thanks a lot to the folks who have. We really appreciate that. And that's it for this week, and I'll see you all next week.